Ready? Good morning. It's good to see everyone today. You know, it's so amazing. The weather today's in the 60s. I mean, what do you do? How many of you carry a coat, an umbrella, a sweater in the car all the time? Because you never know what's going to happen around here. Or how about your snow boots? Anybody got snow boots in the car with them? No? If I need those, I'm staying home. I'm not going anywhere. But good to see everybody this morning. If you would, turn with me to number 696. There's a fountain free. 696. If you're joining us online, we're glad to have you with us this morning too.
557. I did the wrong one. Don't do the other one. I did the wrong one.
Okay, I'm sorry.
You know that
What?
I don't know that one.
557. I didn't either. I just saw the title. 550. Okay.
No, that's the other one. You got
Okay.
it. Yeah, you got it right. It's going to be wrong up here. You got it right.
Oh, I got it right.
Yeah.
Didn't that I say 697?
Yes. I guess it's titled the same. I just grabbed the title.
696. There's a fountain free. 696. So you can't look at the board. That won't work. It's a different melody to it. So we'll sing 696, first and third verses, and then we'll go to our classes. There's a fountain free. There's a fountain free, 'tis for you and me. Let us haste, so haste to its spring. 'Tis a fountain of love from the source above, and He bids us all freely drink. Will you come to the fountain free? Will you come?
There's a fountain. Well, I guess I'm going to have to start my songs like this. So I see the other one we just sang was There's a Fountain Free. And I just pulled up There's a Fountain. You know, we have all the songs by their title in my computer where I just throw them up there. And I guess we're going to start treating it like these two Bibles. Before there were verses and, and chapters and so on. Like we all know Psalm 22 where it says, my God, why is thou forsaken me? We wonder, that's how they used to check them, how it started. And, when we find why did Jesus say the whole thing, it's because there were other Psalms that started my God also. And so you have to read the whole thing. So just a quick bit of information to show my mistake that I did today. So as everyone knows, Brother Ed had it right and I had it wrong. And just like I said, I'm glad we noticed it. Everyone would be going, that ain't the song. So I can see that. So we're going to continue our study of the book of James. Book of James, we're here dealing, of course, with the book of James. And we're in chapter 1, verses 9 and 11 that we'll get to in just a moment. We're talking here about poverty and wealth. Chapter 1, verse 9 through 11. Remember, I'll remind us of a few things about this because this is taken in different ways by different people that teach this. And it always amazes me when you find some teach it one way and others teach it another, when it's pretty clear in the Bible, in the verses of the context here, of what it's actually talking about when it talks about wealth. We know in verse 9 through 11, as I stated that, what happens is this should never be taken out of context or lifted out of the context, as James is talking about a new point here. Because we know in verse 12, when he gets to that, he continues with the discussion of trials, revealing to us that the topics discussed between verse 4 and verse 12 are the context of trials. A lot of times this verses here will be taken up when you hear people preaching on, on wealth and health, and a lot of times that's those people on TV that are saying, send money here to us, do this, help the Lord be wealthy and so on, help our church be like that. And that's not what these verses are about at all. These verses are still dealing with trials, is what James is getting at. So let's go ahead and read it real quick and remind us of what it says, and then I'll get into a few other things too before we get back to where we were last week. So verses 9 through 11, please.
Let the lowly brother glory in his exaltation, but his rich in his humiliation, because as a flower of the field he will pass away. For so sooner has the sun risen with a burning heat that it withers the grass. Its flowers falls, and its beauty appears perishing. So the rich man also will fade away in his pursuits.
Thank you. So we observe I'll tell you what I'm observing on, and I'll show you why in a moment. That we observe the worldly rich doing well in this life. It always happens throughout. And while others suffer with trials, and some think, well, who are worldly, who are wealthy, we really don't think they deal with a lot sometimes. And, how can, someone have steadfast in trials when they see the wicked prospering year after year? And James is going to address this. He's going to address what's happening here. We did that by last week talking about this first part of the verse 9, that let the lowly brother glory in his exaltation, knowing that the lowly brother here appears to be referenced to the Christian who is being crushed by trials. Not just dealing with some trials, but actually crushed, by trials. And she is weak and despair from the suffering, and he or she is presently enduring of what they're going through. So James is going to contrast that with the wealth. And we know verse 10, not verse time, there ain't no time number. Verse 10, he speaks of the rich, and he talks about that going on there. Before he does that, let's go ahead and look at this too. We also said, where it says, let the lowly brother, it is not simply lowly because of life circumstances, but also that has less material wealth. It's kind of a combination of what's happening here. In fact, many translations rightly read humble circumstances, which is a really good translation to try to capture that James is not only referring to material possessions, but also, weak and insignificant, or not insignificant, significant life circumstances, things that go on in this life. And we asked, what does this word exaltation mean? Because we don't use this word much in our language today, in our English language. But I will say this, there's two meanings to it, and I said this last week. One is a position in life or extreme happiness. What we know is what we're dealing with here. He's talking about a position in life. He's talking about what you're dealing with, what's going on. And so as we look at this area here of what James is, this exaltation going on here, we ask, where is the exaltation in the midst of trials? And James is pointing back to the message we learned in James 1, 2, and 4, if you remember. We mentioned this last week, we'll mention it again. And so we're going to read that for us, please.
My brethren, count it all joy when you fall into various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces patience. Let patience have its perfect work, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking nothing.
Thank you. So he's pointing to this, the importance of this, of what we see and what we understand, that various trials are going to happen. Testing our faith is going to take place. But it's all about producing patience. The same thing is going to deal here with this, with this area of somebody that, as we find, is not well off, or they're in bad circumstances, for those who are very wealthy. So poverty versus wealthy, which brings us back to the area that we left off last week, and that is, just a second, things just changed. My clicker started working by computer. I don't know how that happened. That was weird. All right, so That was wild. So the rich, I gotta figure out how I did that. That was pretty cool. So the rich and I guess you'd say his or her humiliation of what's happening here. And James uses a bit of sarcasm, irony to declare that the rich should boast in their humiliation. And we'll explain this when we go through what's happening here. Did you have a comment?
I was just going to interject that when we think about the humility part that James is talking about, I've heard people say to someone that they knew that they were having this terrible trial, and yet they could smile, they went through their day, and people would ask them, what is it that makes you this way? That they're a Christian.
That's right. They have something to look forward to. I mean, they have more. And they probably, we've been talking about this. Once you learn to deal with them properly as a Christian, the trials become not that they're, well, I guess they are kind of, not that they're not an easy trial, but it's easier to get through them, as we find. So by getting to this is what I want to talk about, this moment of who this rich person is. Is it a worldly rich person or a Christian? And as I stated, when you actually look at commentators or scholars, you start reading about them, it's actually split about 50-50, which really shocks me and surprises me, whether it's a worldly rich person or a rich Christian. And the reason I say this, most of the time this goes to, when you get into 50-50, you're dealing with some denominations that believe in the health and wealth, and they're the ones leaning towards the Christian rich, and I'll explain more about that. So as we look at this here, remember essentially James spoke of the lowly brother, verse 9, and when James says, the rich in verse 10, does James imply a rich brother? Does he reply a rich brother, rich sister, rich brethren, or not? Well, I'll say this, while both sides do, I guess you would have some strong arguments. Some of them might be taken out of context. And then you have many scholars that won't even give their opinion. They just ride the fence. Or they'll actually, when they're doing James, which blows my mind, they'll skip verses 9 and 11. They'll just kind of read right through it. And which is amazing. There's no reason for that. So when I get to it, my thought after I read this is, without a doubt, I believe this is a worldly rich person. And I'll explain why. And we start with that with verse 10. In verse 10, notice what we find James says. Verse 10. Someone go ahead and read that for us, please. Verse 10. This is my understanding from my learning, from what I read here, why I believe it is a worldly rich person. Someone read verse 10, please.
But the rich, in his humiliation, because as a flower of the field, he will pass away.
So notice what happens here. James says, he, look what it says there, he will pass away. James does not say that the riches will pass away, but the rich person will pass away. And then James even goes to a little more context with it in verse 11. Someone go and read verse 11 for us, please.
For no sooner has the sun risen with the burning heat that it withers the grass, its flowers fall, and its beautiful appearance perishes. So the rich man also will fade away in his pursuits.
Thank you. So you look at that last part. So the rich man also will fade away in his pursuits. Notice how it's talking about the rich man, how it's saying. Who does it sound a lot like a parable that we have? I heard it.
Rich young fool.
The rich young ruler, and there's another one. The rich man and Lazarus. Think about the way they are. And it kind of sounds like that when you read this. The reason I say this, James does not say that the riches will fade away in its pursuits of what's there. It would not be accurate to say the Christian, who have wealth are going to pass away and be burned up. That wouldn't be accurate to say like that. But this would be very accurate statement concerning the unbelievers who are rich, that they will pass away and be burned up. Remember, when he talks to believers who have money who are rich, he says, look, you need to figure out who comes first because you know better. Here he doesn't show that at all. He just shows, guess what? He's going to be done with, and that's it. So this is why my thoughts, when I study this, I'm very careful saying what I think. It's from my studies I get this, and I think you can probably see it too, is that James is contrasting a Christian who is suffering trials, and that we know with the wealthy, whom just seem to have it all. And, whatever they're going through in life. And James, therefore, is offering comfort to the Christians in these humble circumstances. When we think about this, the rich are well off, and perhaps, and I'm sure, I've seen it, and I'm sure you have too, that their wealth at times will cause them, or can cause them to avoid some of the suffering that's going on in this world, some of the trials. that others must endure. That because the money, they're able to buy their way out of it or whatever it is, or take the money and do whatever they need to get through it. But they will receive, this is what James is saying. Don't let that cause you to lose your Christianity or not to be the way you should, because they will receive their humiliation. Notice what I said, not their humbleness, their humiliation. It will come out, he says. So the Christian must not look at the worldly rich and think to themselves that they are better off. You know, I've counseled many people through my life as a preacher, and it always amazes me how sometimes that will come up. And they'll be like, but look at so-and-so. They don't even love God. They don't like God at all. They're doing great. And I'm like, you know, that's not how we're supposed to look at things. We're not supposed to be concerned with that. If you're concerned with that, go to them and tell them about God. Tell them about Jesus to try to bring them to Him. I said, don't be concerned that it feels like they're better off than you are, because they may be in this moment, but they're not going to experience that if they stay that way when it comes to the end. And that's what we see being talked about here, and the way, you know, that James is going about that, the life of, you know, the humiliation. Then, you know, he says if someone wants to be two-faced, you know, if they want to be, in a sense, do both ways, or be double-minded, their loyalties, you know, when we go to a Christian side, you know, the brothers like sisters like, I want to be like them. Well, if we want to be double-minded, have money and God, I don't mean have it, there's nothing wrong with having money, but if we take money and do this, if that's our most important thought, where is it going to be to God? It's going to be up here. And what's going to control our thoughts then? Money. It's not going to be God. And he basically is saying, if that's how you want to do it, go ahead. He goes, but don't think that's going to get you to heaven. Nobody can buy their way to heaven. As some will tell you on TV, send your money here and God will bless you. That is not the way it works. Not that we're not supposed to contribute our money to the work of the church, but it doesn't work in the way they're saying it. Jennifer was first. Jennifer, go ahead.
I'm just a little confused where it says, let the lowly brother glory in his exaltation, but the rich, referring back to glory, the rich should glory in his humiliation. I don't understand.
Okay, because the first part of the exaltation is the humbleness for the brother or sister in Christ, is that they're supposed to be, you know, they're in that circumstance of life that they're in right now, what they're dealing with. And they're humbled in it, you know, they're weighted down by it and you do it. The other part where it says there, you're talking about the glory of the humiliation. It's talking about, he's not glorying in it now, but he will be in his humiliation when God comes for that day of judgment. In other words, they're thinking, everything's good, everything's great, go ahead and do that, but one day you're going to be humiliated for everything you've done and the way you stood in your life. And that's what we see James getting at as he deals with this. And sometimes it's kind of difficult things because the way the Greek is backwards, the way we read this, the way we read it. So that putting into our sense was read the other way to make a little more sense. But with our sense of understanding the way the English language is, it shows us that God is referring to that person of what they will go through in the end. And it's just like the rich man. That's what I'll get to. I see a bunch of hands. The rich man with Lazarus, as I was saying, you know, the rich man thought he had it all and didn't think he needed to do anything else for anybody. And then in the end, when he was there, he was being humiliated because of the fact, remember what he asked Abraham to do? What did he ask Abraham to do? Go tell who? Send Lazarus back and tell my brothers, you know, and let them know, this is not worth it. This is not worth what you've done on earth to have this. No way. And that's what we see dealing with here, is what James is getting at. All right, so I got three. I'm going to go through 1, 2, 3. All right, Dad, go ahead first.
This idea of glory in his exaltation doesn't mean that the brother who is a Christian, that individual is not being boastful in his life.
Exactly.
He's saying, well, look what I have versus what you have. This exaltation is, I kind of get the idea that he knows that in the end, even no matter what he faces, it's like Paul says, this light affliction, that the exaltation is going to be that home in heaven.
Yep.
But the other, in his thoughts, is he raises himself up to be better than anybody else, like the rich man. Right. I think of Scrooge McDuck, you know, when you see the cartoon, he's sitting on his pile of gold and he doesn't care about anything that happens to anybody else but just himself.
That's exactly
but he's worried about his money too, losing it.
Yes, and there's so many examples of that in the Bible. It's like the man that, had everything from the fields, and he, instead of helping people, he built more barns and, to store more of it. And he lost it all. And, and that's what we see getting at here.
But Job's a good example of that.
Job's a great example of that, exactly right. I mean, and then what he deals with, is it's, when we're exalted, we're in that circumstance at that time when you're being crushed by it, knowing that something better is going to come with it. That's why that's why James noticed, didn't put verses 9-11 first. He put exactly what it has to deal with, going through a trial, dealing with judgment, dealing with things that are there, and knowing how to get through them and count them, as good, count them as we see that a blessing, and even though we don't look at it that way, but knowing how we can come out with it with patience and joy and all that stuff forth. Mom, go ahead.
I was just going to say that not always is the rich man fully rich, but he is working. He may be a Christian, but he is working so hard to make money, not just to live by, but to make it better for his family, that he's missing. Not able to do the work of the church because he's so busy making money, or he is missing services because he has to work 7 days a week. No.
Right. And and James is kind of talking about that in a sense with this because he's one of the person that's the Christian here versus the worldly person. They're like, why can't I be like that? Well, that's where God's kind of like, if you want to be that way, look what's going to happen to you. So, don't turn to that direction. Now, it's nothing wrong, like I said. Nobody think that I'm saying it's wrong to have money and work for it. That's not the case at all. We just need to remember who always comes first. And I think sometimes that can be lost. That could be, well, I'll give God the same as the money. No, you can't do that either. It can't be a tie. I mean, it has to be like this. And that's what we see there. I'm going to go to Doug first. Doug was next. Go ahead, Doug.
Well, I kind of, Kalita, she was saying kind of the way I was thinking was that the rich, because he's in the verse before, he says, let the brother of low degree, but the rich, he doesn't say it's not a brother. And it looks to me like maybe what he's trying to say is that the lower would be exalted and come up, and the rich would be taken down, would lose some of it, but they would be equal in the, because everybody's going to be equal in heaven.
That's exactly right.
Rich and poor.
That's right. Oh, that's exactly right. It's going to be the same all the way across, we see. And, and that's where, we talked about how, God uses those understandings of the last will be the first will be last, and he goes all through that trying to explain those thoughts. And that's kind of what James, true at the same time, is getting here. It's what it is all about is when people are in a dire need like that, and say they have a best friend or a really good friend that's really well off, they're not a member of the church, and that they start thinking that can happen. Why aren't they dealing with what I'm dealing with? That's what James is trying to do. Don't let that crush you more than where you're already at. Remember, he says, take joy and patience in it, get through it, because you can be humbled today, but they're going to be humbled or humiliated in the end, is what he's getting at there. And as we see that, I just went blank. as we see that happen. Brother Clifford, go ahead.
It's just kind of like what Doug was saying, Christianity brings dignity to us. And we should all be thankful, that God does not see rich and poor. We're all born as a Christian. And of course, in this life, in the fleshly life, the rich man in pursuit of all of his richness, he'll face some types of humiliations in that, and we can see the examples of that in our everyday life with the Bitcoin people who exhorted Bitcoin in pursuits of ultra richness, and ultimately he was taken down.
Right.
Because in those pursuits, he was humiliated.
Yep, and that's the word, that's why I like looking at exactly right there. He was humiliated in those pursuits. That's exactly it. Go ahead.
And I was going to say too, remember Paul, riches are not evil in themselves.
Nope.
But Paul, remember he said that riches, I just went blank with the verse. that riches are, in a sense, evil, meaning that pursuing them to that degree is bad. It's kind of, and tell me if I'm wrong, but it's kind of like a parallel. You know, we're told at one time to look at Christians that are doing what they're supposed to be doing and build ourselves up to them. We look at that. Then we also, sometimes we look at that person who's the rich person and we say, and they're not suffering like I am. So what's going to happen? I'm going to follow them now? You know, and I don't know if that's wrong thought, but that's kind of what's going through my mind too.
Right.
With what you're saying.
That's exactly right. I mean, you know, and it comes to this, back to this, all that was being said, you know, James reminds us, just like all throughout the Bible, you know, our first thought should always be the spiritual side.
Absolutely.
The people that are Christians, that know and understand as we come to Christ, our first thought should always be the spiritual side, that our thought should be of heaven. What happens when someone is not of God, their first thought and all their thoughts are right here in this moment of today. And remember, we know that God tells us, you know, this is but just a moment. You know, this is but just a twinkling of an eye. And, you know, I've done that, you know, I did that one I said that I saw before with the rope. You know, that you have this long rope that goes all the way around this building, and there's a piece of red tape on it, only this much. This is your life on earth. All that other is everything else you think of eternity of heaven. And guess how many people they say, you're crazy for following God and giving up things here on this earth that maybe you could have had if you just gave up God. And all they're doing is worried about this little moment, and we're concerned about the other. And that's what he's getting at here with the Christian. He's saying, you know, don't forget that. And because whoever James is speaking to, he knows that Christians are going to deal with. Remember, he's inspired by God to write these words. And he's dealing with the everyday Christian. He's talking about the 12 tribes, these Jewish Christians. And think about a lot of those Jewish Christians. And this is why I believe this is so important with James explaining this to the 12 tribes, is because I'm sure a lot of them at one time were really well off, doing well. But remember, they were, even though they were a Jew looking at God, they really weren't. They were more of their money. And now they're like, why can't I be like so-and-so over there, like what I used to have, or maybe where I was at, or maybe they never had it, and they say, I want it. And he says, don't. And I'll tell you this, someone that has that attitude, that thought, you know, I got to have that, and, you know, because they're better off than I am, God knows right then that you don't need that money because he knows what it's going to turn you into. He's going to do everything, remember, to keep us from being tempted. Going to keep us, you know, to move it in the right way. And sometimes that's what it is. Sometimes we'll do without things, even though we ask God for it, because God knows we can't handle it, or we can't deal with it. And that happens from time to time. As hard as it is to think about it or see, that's what we find. So as we deal with this, we go through this knowing that the Christian must not look at the worldly rich and think they're better off. And, you know, and without, unless somebody want to take, you know, just be like them and take heed in their humiliation, and we don't want that. So as we look at this, remember, this is why it's so important there when we see it. The grass withers, the flower falls, the beauty perishes under the scorching heat of the sun. So also will the rich wither and fall in the midst of his or her pursuits, as we said a moment ago about pursuits. And that's exactly right. That's what James is getting at here. Knowing that most people that are really well off and they're worldly, they don't have God, they're engaged in their schedules, activities, completely neglecting God. Even if they believe in God, you see them heading in that direction. And there's the difference. Dad, go ahead.
This world is not my home. I'm just a passing through. That's what you're talking about.
That's exactly right.
You know, and we'll know all about it by and by.
Yep.
Those are two songs that when we sing those, we ought to be thinking about the words.
Mm-hmm.
And if we truly believe it, we'll bring down, in a sense, the rafters of this building and give glory and praise to God.
Yep, exactly. That's right. You know, that's where when I got back to this word exaltation, you know, James is saying, do not think the rich are in a better position in life than you are. That's what he's saying. You know, with that exaltation, he goes, it's your position in life you're doing right now. It doesn't mean you'll always be there. It doesn't mean that maybe you might have money at one time, I don't know, but he's saying, don't look at it that way. Because they will be brought low in humiliation while you are being exalted in your lowliness. There's the difference of the two that we find. It's basically just like this. And we went on to this statement, the grass is not greener on the other side as most think it is. You know, not greener on the other side. Better to be lowly of humble circumstances now and exalted later than rich now and humiliated by God. That's what we see there when we think about this. You know, how many have you ever seen cattle or, or goats or sheep, or whatever it may be, grazing, and then they look over on the other side of that fence and they see what's over there, and they do everything they can to get through that fence. And then get on the other side of that fence and who knows, get killed, get shot, whatever it may be. It's not always greener just because it may look that way. Which brings us to number 2. He tells us to take delight in knowledge that we are being made into complete Christians lacking nothing. Remember how James talked about that earlier. We could be people lacking nothing. And what he means by that is we're lacking nothing what it takes to get to heaven. That we're doing everything in our power to get there. Which brings us to the final one. Remain patient under trials. Remain patient. Because look what God has done. James says God has promised a reward for our endurance. That's what he does. He's promised us a reward. He has not promised a reward to the worldly rich. He says he's promised them humiliation if they continue heading down that road. And that's what we find with us today. Remember, this life is not a sprint. It's a long, long, long marathon. And we will get to the end one day. Sometimes it may feel like, we don't want to say, when's it going to end, And I've said that before, when I was at camp as a young camper, that one of the boys led a prayer, and he prayed, God, come get us all right now, and my eyes opened up that wide, and I wasn't the only one. And even one of the adults, I thought, what? I mean, it's like, and you look at that, and there's the thought, meaning, not that he was terrible in his life, but he's like, knew how much better it would be there. And I asked him later about it, he said, you know what we're experiencing here at camp, how great this is being around Christians all the time for this whole week? Imagine if we had that all the time. And me, a young man, at first I was like, that makes a lot of sense. You're crazy. I'm not ready to go yet. That's where I went to. But, but we understand that. And if we can get to our mindset to that there's nothing here that should be holding us back from wanting to be with God in heaven, then it will be better here. We will learn those ways of a Christian and how to live the way God says. Dad, go ahead.
The idea of humble is, it's not me, God, it's you that I lean to. Humble and lowly, right in the sight of God. That's where we need to be.
Yes. And that's exactly it. And that's the way God looks at it. You think, Jesus always say this, on the Sermon on the Mount, first thing he said was, blessed are the poor in spirit. And that means blessed are the humble. First thing he said, basically he was getting at, you can't get to all these other Beatitudes unless you have this one first. And that's how it is a Christian. We truly have to humble ourselves to make the choice to follow God. It's faith. And we have to humble ourselves to do that. To believe Jesus, the Son of God. Confess it before others. Repent of our sins. Be baptized for remission of our sins. Knowing the blood we come in contact. That's having a humble attitude, knowing I can't do this by myself. I can't get myself to heaven. It took Jesus to do what he did. And then I need to respond to the way he would ask me. And so that's what James was showing us with all these areas. Any comments or questions before we finish up these verses and move on to the next one? Anybody else? How much time do I have? I got a little bit of time. All right, let's jump to the next one real quick. The Christian and temptation. James 12 through 18. James 1, 12 through 18. There's a lot of this, of course. We know how temptation is. We've all of us here have been tempted. We're probably tempted, more than we want to be from time to time, and we see that. And remember, nobody is void of temptation. Even Jesus himself went through temptation. But what we do see is Jesus did it without sinning, and there's the difference. And we know that it says, in the Bible says, all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. We're all going to do that, and that's it. But it doesn't mean, he says to say, it means you just go ahead and keep sinning, thinking it's an okay thing to do. That's not what he's getting at here. But he does know we're going to be tempted. And that's what I was getting at. I just think it's so interesting how James, how inspired by God goes from what he did in the beginning about having joy, patience, and in trials and temptations, and then he jumps into the poverty and wealth. And now, how they look at scripture, I want to be wealthy, I want to be just like them, and he immediately goes to the temptation here, because that's what's happening if you get that thought. You're being tempted. So how do we get through it? Well, let's go ahead and realize this. Read these verses here, 12 through 18. and see what he had to say. It'll be a few slides, so please read that for us.
Blessed is the man who endures temptation, for when he has been approved, he will receive the crown of life, which the Lord has promised to those who love him. Let no one say when he is tempted, I am tempted by God. For God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he himself tempt anyone. But each one is tempted when he is drawn away by his own desires and enticed. Then when he desires has convinced, it gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is full grown, brings forth death. Do not be deceived, my beloved brethren. Every good gift and every perfect gift is from above and comes down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shadow of turning. Of his own will he brought us forth by the word of truth, that we might be a kind of first fruits of his creatures.
Thank you. You know, we said something, this was said earlier about God seeing us all the same. You know, as people, don't matter if you're rich or poor, whatever it is, or you know, middle class, wherever you're at. You know, nobody said no variation. I mean, and that's how we have to think about that when we look at this. So we get back to these verses here, these new ones of Christian temptation. One of the greatest challenges of living the Christian life, I guarantee you without a doubt, from what we read in the Bible, is dealing with temptation. That was, you know, that was the hallmark of what Jesus' approach, how he handled Satan. And you notice it was I mean, how quick was it into his mission? Basically, when he started telling people about Christ, about who he was, how quick was it? It was like immediate. I mean, it was really not far at all. And the reason why is because the devil knew the people that Jesus could influence with who he was, and the devil wanted to try to beat that. And it amazes me that the devil knew that Jesus was the Son of God, knew he was God on earth, but at the same time knew he was human, and said, I have an opportunity here to make this man, to make God go away. You think the devil was mad at God for casting him to this earth? Without a doubt. He was already mad at God starting the war. They talk about this battle. I mean, he's already upset with him, mad with everything. So he's going to do everything he can to try to get anybody that is a part of God to him. And that's how it is through temptations. But what's interesting, the more mature we get, and remember, James talked about that in maturity in those first verses that we looked at. You know, the more mature we get, should temptations get easier to handle? Should they?
Yes.
I believe so, without a doubt. They should. Does it mean we're not going to be tempted? No, I don't think that's ever going to happen. We're always going to be tempted while we're here on this earth, but it should get easier to handle because we've dealt with others and we know what to do. But here, as you think about who do you think is probably the most influenced by temptations when it comes to a Christian?
The young.
The young. I would say not just young as in age, but young spiritually, the new Christian. And when you're a new Christian, the devil knows, you come out of the water, you're excited, you're on fire, you're like, yeah, and then throws things at you. I know it's kind of like a preacher's going to preacher school. They come out of school and they're on fire, they're just ready to explode. And I think I probably the best advice I ever had with an elder. He said, look, you've been in training of the Bible for 2 straight years. Every day you were fed the Bible, fed the Bible, fed the Bible. You learned about it even at night when you were home or in the morning early before you went. He goes, not that hire somebody as in your power, strength of God. He goes, but you're up here when it comes to the Word of God, where most of the congregation is going to be here, meaning you're on fire ready to explode. He says you need to do this. Not that you want to be on fire with it. He says, but you need to let everybody continue to catch up. That's why you learn those things and you teach those things. And I thought that was great advice. And, because that's what happens as a new Christian. New Christian, you're on fire, you're thinking you're good, and the next thing you know, you are just outside the building, and the devil tempts you. Or outside of that water, wherever you may be, the devil starts tempting you. Thinking, wait a minute, I'm a new Christian. I'm not supposed to be tempted anymore. It's not the way it works. He's going to do everything he can. We know it can be frustrating. We know that our sins, have been forgiven, and then we sin pretty quick. Or we sin down the road, or whatever it may be. To find ourselves bombarded by temptation that wants us to continue in sin. That's where it's at. I want you to think about the devil as a roaring lion. And it can't keep us scared or afraid, because we have a God that is stronger, a Christ that is mightier, and we can get through all of it. That's why we're told there in 1 Corinthians that without a doubt, that God knows that He always gives us an escape to get away from Him. And if we take Him up on that, guess what we can do? We can escape it. May not be easy, but we can do it. And we learn to do it. And that's what we find. Can't read any more, I'm out of time. So as we'll go ahead and stop there. Perfect place to stop. We barely got into this. We'll come back and look at these verses 12 through 18. And we're going to find these helpful words for the Christian in the form of, I'll just say this, form of a promise, a caution, and then an understanding is what we find He's going to show us. And we'll leave it there. Thank you. Appreciate it. Any comments for it, brother? Anybody at all? Nope. All right, thanks.
Hey, how you doing, brother? Good to see you this morning.
Thank you.